Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast. Put on your headphones and get ready for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. Develop schedule is the main topic of this lesson. The develop schedule process involves the analysis of activity sequences, activity durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create the project schedule model. After this analysis is completed, you can enter the resulting information about schedule activities, durations, resource availabilities, and so on, and the logical relationships as well, into your scheduling tool. And this then allows you to create or generate your project schedule, which serves as your initial schedule baseline. In this lesson, we will therefore focus on analyzing the outputs of previous project time management and other processes that act as inputs to our process here. We'll be entering the analyzed information into a scheduling tool to create an initial schedule model. We'll be performing schedule network analysis using available tools and techniques, and finally, creating the initial schedule baseline to be used iteratively in the control schedule process. Because the develop schedule process is such a large process involving many activities, we had to divide it up into 4 parts. Here in part 1, you'll get a general overview and we'll look at the inputs. Then in parts 2 and 3, we will look at the tools and the techniques. And finally, in part 4, we will define the outputs of the process, give you a lesson review, as well as some sample questions, study focus tips, and some exam tips as well. The official PMBOK guide definition for project time management is: project time management includes the processes required to manage the timely completion of the project. This is accomplished by defining activities, which are then sequenced. Then we give them an approximate duration. We assign resources, and then the sequenced list of activities of a given time and resources is a schedule that is modified and executed over the project lifecycle. Let's review the processes together. Remember, we're looking at develop schedule in this lesson, so everything that happens before we get to that 6th process leads up to that 6th process. It all begins with plan schedule management. This is the process of establishing the policies, procedures, and documentation for planning, developing, managing, executing, and controlling the project schedule. In this process, we will, for instance, plan what scheduling tool we will be using later on in the develop schedule process. Then we move on to define activities. This is the process of identifying and documenting the specific actions to be performed to produce the project deliverables. From this process, we get the list of our activities, which later on in Develop Schedule we'll have to input into the scheduling tool. Once we know the activities for our project, we can sequence them. We can put them in order. This is the process of identifying and documenting relationships among the project activities. And of course, these relationships later on need to be put into our scheduling tool so that we can develop our schedule. Now we're moving on to estimate activity resources. This is the process of estimating the type and quantities of material, human resources, equipment, or supplies required to perform each activity. As an example, from this process, we take the names of those people assigned to the individual activities, and in Develop Schedule, we'll add them into the scheduling tool again, so we know exactly who is working on which activity. Once that process is over, we can now estimate activity durations. This is the process of estimating the number of work periods needed to complete individual activities with estimated resources. And yes, you guessed it, these durations, we are going to be using them in the develop schedule process so that we have an idea of how long each activity takes. There is no sense of having a schedule that just shows 1 day for each activity. They need to be input into the tool so we get a real schedule. So, develop schedule, the process of analyzing activity sequence, durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create the project schedule model. And you can tell by the definition here. The activity sequences, durations, resource requirements, schedule constraints, all of this was defined in the previous processes for the develop schedule activities. And once we have done this, we now have our schedule baseline. We're handing everything off into the executing process group where the activities are actually being performed by the people who are assigned to it. We need to control our schedule as well. This is the process of monitoring the status of project activities, to update project progress and manage changes to the schedule baseline to achieve our plan. And I bet you already know what's coming on this slide here. Yes, this is the slide where we show you into which process group our individual processes fall. You know the first 5 processes there. Well, you can see it on the screen. They're in the planning process group, and the last one is in the monitoring and controlling process group. Do you remember into which process group develop schedule falls? Yes, it is also a planning process. Remember, we don't actually execute the schedule in project time management. We just sort of create the schedule and then we hand everything off for execution to other processes. The main concept for the develop schedule process is that this is where we enter, analyze, and optimize our project schedule. We enter the information created from the performance of prior project processes necessary to create the project schedule into our scheduling tool. We analyze the data entered into the scheduling tool to formulate the project schedule model, and we optimize the project schedule model data in order to develop the project schedule. By performing these sets of activities, you will be able to effectively create your project schedule model and effectively analyze and optimize it in order to create your initial project schedule and initial schedule baseline. We have seen this slide here in previous lessons, and I wanted to bring it up quickly just to remind you that the project management plan is not the same as your project schedule. Your project management plan describes how the work will be performed, and the project schedule shows your activities on a timeline. While many people use the terms project management plan and schedule interchangeably for the PMP exam, these are two quite distinct documents. Let's take a brief look at figure 616 from the PMBOK guide, the ITTO Overview, and I bet this process gets the gold medal. Definitely for the largest number of inputs there, 13, but probably also for the largest total number of ITTOs, which, if I'm counting this right, is 27 of them. As we have already learned, the majority of the inputs are in fact outputs of the 5 previous project time management processes, so we've seen many of these before. Then we have tools and techniques that are specific to developing the schedule and the outputs, which include the schedule baseline and the project schedule. Now let's take a closer look at the inputs. Let us begin simply by listing the inputs by name. It all starts with the schedule management plan. We also need the activity list, the activity attributes, the project schedule network diagrams, the activity resource requirements, the resource calendars, the activity durations, and the project scope statement. And these 8 just fill this one slide here. But we have a few more to go. We have the risk register, the project staff assignments, the resource breakdown structure, the enterprise environmental factors, the organizational process assets, and since they have obviously thrown everything into this process that they could find, we might as well throw the kitchen sink in there as well. Just kidding. Well, when you look at this list, you're probably thinking, wow, we're pretty much using the whole project environment as an input to this process. And you're absolutely right. And as I've said many times before, it's less important for you to memorize each of these inputs by name, but you should more importantly learn the general concepts and why we need them as inputs to this process. Let's do that. Because we've seen all of these inputs previously, the next 7 slides are going to be a fast and furious review of the why. Why do we need these inputs for this process here? So hold on to your hats. We begin with the project scope statement. It contains assumptions and constraints that can impact the development of the project schedule. For example, we need to finish the oil rig platform in the Gulf of Mexico before the hurricane season starts. Then the schedule management plan identifies the scheduling method and specific scheduling tool that will be used to create the schedule, as well as how the schedule will be formulated. For example, the scheduling tool that we use is contained in the Primavera portfolio management software application. Next, we have the activity list. This list identifies all activities that we need to be including in the project schedule model by their name. Along with the activity list, we also have the activity attributes, which provide the detailed information that is used to build the project schedule model, like predecessors and successor activities. This is followed by the activity duration estimates. These contain the quantitative assessment of the likely number of work periods that will be required to complete each activity and in turn used to formulate the project schedule. For example, activity A takes 3 days and activity B takes 22 days. Then we have the activity resource requirements. They identify the types and quantities of resources required for each activity and are used to create the project schedule model. For example, we need 200 meters of cable for activity A and 3 trucks for activity B. The resource breakdown structure is next. We need this because it provides the details that allow us resource analysis and organizational reporting. We also have the resource calendars as an input. They contain information on the availability of the resources for our project. For example, Joe is on vacation in August and Avantika is assigned to another project for the next 6 weeks, but then she is all ours. We are moving on to the project staff assignments. They specify which resources are assigned to each project activity. For example, Joe is assigned to activity A and Avantika is assigned to activity B. We also use the risk register. It provides detail of all identified risks and their respective characteristics that affect the project schedule model. For example, if it rains, then activity A will take twice as long. Next, we have everybody's favorite, the enterprise environmental factors. They include such things as, for example, standards, communication channels, and the specific scheduling tool that is to be used in developing the schedule model. But let's also not forget the organizational process assets that can influence the develop schedule process. And here we're talking about such things as, for example, the scheduling methodology and the resource calendars. And last but not least, we have the project schedule network diagrams. They are a graphical representation of logical relationships, also referred to as dependencies, among the project schedule activities, also containing logical relationships of activity predecessors and successors in the project schedule. But unlike we saw them in the activity attributes, here we're talking about a graphical representation of these predecessors and successor activities. And that's it, because I don't think we actually have to talk about the kitchen sink, do we? But before we finish our discussion of the inputs to the develop schedule process, let's take a look at how we would input all of this information into a scheduling tool in order to understand why we need all of these inputs as a basis to develop our schedule. Let's do this together, step by step. The first thing we have to do is start our company's scheduling tool, the software application. And if we don't know what scheduling tool our company uses, we will have to look this up in our enterprise environmental factors. Another reason why we need these EEF can be of a completely different nature. On many of my projects, I often had to delay phases so that they would start in the next budget period. That way, the expenses for phase 2 would accrue in the new budget period and not in the current one. And these constraints would be part of our enterprise environmental factors. Then, once the scheduling tool has been started, we have to input some basic information about our new project, like the start and finish dates of the project. These would be found in the project calendar, which are part of the organizational process assets. Now we can begin to input our activities and their detailed information into the scheduling tool. For this, we need the activity list and the activity attributes. We now need to put the activities into the correct sequence. This information is found in the project schedule network diagram in the graphical representation. This diagram is an output from the sequence activities process and tells us exactly in which sequence the activities should be performed. We're now going to assign resources to our activities. We can find this information in the activity resource requirements, but we also have to take their availability into consideration, and that information is found in the resource calendars. Next, the scheduling tool is going to ask us to define the duration of each of our activities. This information comes to us from the estimate activity duration process, and it can be found in the activity duration estimates. We are now going to review everything that we have input, and we are also going to make sure that we haven't forgotten anything, like the major scope assumptions and constraints which we have defined in the project scope statement. And those were more or less the steps that you will have to perform as you are creating a project schedule. Let's review. You start the scheduling tool. You input the basic information into your scheduling tool. You input the activities into the scheduling tool. You put the activities into the correct sequence. You assign resources to each of these activities. You define the duration for each activity. You review the inputs for completeness, and by performing all of these steps, you create your project schedule. These steps really define why we need all of these inputs. And now that you have heard the reasoning behind why we do this and behind why we need these inputs, I bet it makes much more sense to you, and you can now more easily remember all these 13 inputs just by thinking of these steps here. I have one final note for you in regards to the inputs to this process. If you and I think about entering these inputs, we almost automatically think of putting them into a scheduling tool that's part of a software application. Well, the PMBOK guide does not necessarily make this assumption and doesn't care what scheduling tool you use, be it automated or manual on paper. For the PMP exam, you will need to understand the inputs outside any kind of software application-centric thinking. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 here in this lesson. So Justine and I say goodbye. Well, to be precise, Justine says,
Keep it going.
And I say, until next time.